and welcome to the first episode of our new panel show, The Debate. I'm your host, Joe Kelly, and in these episodes we'll be delving into a range of topics with the help of some very special guests. Today's question is a burning one. Is the United Kingdom facing a democratic crisis? And here to guide us through this political minefield are Sir Graham Brady, the Salford-born Conservative who first became an MP in 1997, going on to chair the 1922 committee, Claire Fox, Brexit Party MEP and founder of the Academy of Ideas think tank, and John Leech, former Liberal Democrat MP and current leader of the opposition on Manchester City Council. Thank you all for joining us. Let's get straight to it. Is the United Kingdom facing a democratic crisis? The word democracy derives from ancient Greek, demos meaning people and kratos meaning power. But how much power is really in the hands of the people? Today we will explore what effect the Brexit referendum and subsequent toing and froing has had on our democracy. With all sides of the debate invoking the principle of democracy, whom are we really to believe? According to Freedom House's 2019 study, Freedom in the World, the UK is extremely democratic, attaining a maximum score. But is that the whole story? And have recent years had a damaging effect? Let's begin with the referendum itself. On the 23rd of June 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union by a margin of 51.9 to 48.1%. And let's begin by talking about direct democracy. We'll start with you, Graham. Since 2010, the British people has been asked to have its say on some pretty fundamental constitutional questions. We've had Scottish independence referendum, the electoral reform, and also EU membership. Are we not living in the most democratic time in this nation?
In some ways, but I'm always very cautious about direct democracy. I think representative democracy is generally a better way of approaching things. What happened with the EU issue, of course, as we saw during the referendum campaign, was that all of the main political parties were essentially taking the same position. So we had the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats and the SNP and probably everybody else, barring one or two, making a case for Remain, and you had what then emerged to be a majority of popular opinion on the other side. And I think if you've got that massive gap between the elected representatives and the views of the people they're meant to represent, there does come a point where you have to resolve it in a different way.
So was direct democracy the only way, Claire Fox, that we would ever have resolved the question of European membership?
No, I think, however, that I also am not, I don't particularly like plebiscites as a way of resolving things, but it was a big constitutional question. And actually, a lot of the political parties wanted that referendum for different reasons, and I think it was called very much to resolve what had become a kind of thorn in the side of British politics, whether we should or shouldn't be in the European Union. So having a referendum seemed like a good idea. I didn't campaign for it, but I was perfectly glad to have it. But I was, I wasn't an elected representative. I was just a voter like anyone else. And I thought, well, I might vote Leave in this, and I got involved in speaking at some Leave events. It turned into something else. And one of the things that just might be interesting for your viewers is that there was some concern when it was initially called that the turnout might not be great. There was some concern that it might be a little bit like the voting reform referendum, which had not really seen a huge turnout. Despite the fact that some people were passionate about whether we're in or out of the EU, a lot of people were a bit like, oh, I don't know, do I? So the powers that be, because I was actually at some of the discussions on this, said things like, we've got to really get people motivated. So they said, we're going to tell people it's the most important vote of a lifetime. We're going to really mobilise people, look them in the eye and say they have got the decision. And in a way, it was the first time people felt their vote might count. For, they really meant something. And the government was asking them, the establishment were asking them to decide something about the future of Britain. I think people took it very seriously. And as Graham says, I think that maybe the crisis, such as it is democratically, is that those people voted in good faith, and then the people who'd called the referendum said, oh my God, you voted the wrong way. And that is, in a way, kind of unravelled to the point that we're at now.
Where do you stand on that question,
Well,
John?
I think it was really interesting the words that you used, because you said that direct democracy was the only way of resolving the European issue, to paraphrase what you said. I would say totally the opposite. What the referendum has done has completely opened a hornet's nest, which is going to continue to buzz around for the next many, many years, because regardless of the outcome of this general election, regardless of whether the Tories get a majority and they deliver the withdrawal agreements, or whether we end up with another hung parliament and a parliament that can't decide what it wants to do about the European Union, that's only going to be the start of the process. There's actually, direct democracy has basically thrown a hand grenade into the whole issue of Europe, and it's not going to go away, regardless of whether we leave, and then we have this start of the process for discussing all about the future arrangements between ourselves and the rest of Europe, or whether suddenly there's a political earthquake and people decide actually we don't want to leave after all, and we elect a parliament that says no, we're not going to leave. It's not going to solve the problem.
But I think, don't you think that that's a bit retrospective? I mean, you may or may not be correct, but all I'm saying is that that referendum was called, even if it was called cynically, by David Cameron because he wanted to resolve the issue of the EU within the Tory party and feeling as though UKIP, which was an insurgent
I think it was
party,
way more cynical than that. I think it was about the perceived threat of UKIP.
Yeah,
that's
why I just mentioned UKIP, but I'm saying so. But however cynical one is, that's not the point. What I'm saying is, David Cameron, as the Prime Minister, might have called it for any number of cynical reasons, but the electorate were asked a serious question by the government, and actually all the political parties said yes, a referendum's appropriate. So they went along with it, right? And so everybody said, oh yes, largely, by the way, because they thought that there'd be a referendum and that Remain would win. That's what happened. Yep. And what went wrong in this whole, political establishment attempt at having a referendum to resolve the European Union question was that the electorate voted in a way that nobody in the establishment had anticipated.
But I would,
then it unravelled for them.
I would argue, though, that it wasn't. It didn't ask a sensible question. It actually just asked a far too simplistic question.
Yes, but it asked
without
the question
actually.
We'll come later to how the question was phrased and how that should be acted upon. But even from this brief discussion at the start, we can see that even the question of having a referendum is polarising. And I wanted to touch upon polarisation within the referendum first. We'll come back to you, Graham. We hear all the time that it was so polarising and that's been damaging. What I wanted to probe a little bit is polarisation necessarily a negative thing in a democracy where, if what is a democracy if not the open battle for the future, for ideas, for ideology to come through?
I think there was a problem that happened, probably started with the first Blair government but went on, which was that there was an increasing attempt to make party politics and elections in this country more scientific. I think using the kind of American model of political science, where particular voters would be targeted, all of the parties would pursue the same identified groups of swing voters, trying to offer the same kind of policies that might appeal to that narrow segment. And I think it did tend to leave an awful lot of people who weren't in that narrow slice thinking, who is it that's really speaking for me? So I think that started to generate a problem where we will all have heard, or at least Claire probably wasn't on the doorsteps in those days, but John and I certainly will have heard that constant refrain of, oh, they're all the same, why should I bother? And there was an element of truth in it. There was a great drive to seek similar solutions to appeal to the same group of people.
And Claire, I've heard you be fairly outspoken in the past about this idea of managerial utilitarian politicians, that that sort of political science way of looking at a group of voters and saying how can we get them. Do you think that the polarisation in this, the referendum and the subsequent fallout from it has actually brought ideology back into politics and given a bit of that agency back to the people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think Graham described it well. I mean, it's been known as third way, and a lot of people talk about it as technocratic rule. It's not, by the way, just confined to the UK. I mean, it's become a kind of European or the Western world is dominated by that kind of, there is no alternative, just tinker around, as you say, using evidence-based methods to intervene with the electorate as though they're kind of kind of something you do things to, rather than treating them as these equals. So the difficulty was that people did feel excluded, and that's what I'm saying is, in good faith, they were asked a question about the future of the United Kingdom and its constitution in relation to the European Union. And at first people were a bit like, what's this about? And then they kind of got excited because they thought, oh, God, they want to know what we think. And people took that seriously. Now, that was polarising in as much as, I think you've rightly said, there was two sides of it, but, that's not the voters' fault. They were asked, are you for or against staying in the European Union? one could argue whether that was the good thing. So that polarised people because they had to think, am I for or against staying in the European Union? And people argued over it. I think that, so polarisation, of course, is the heart of politics for me. It's the basis on which you have competing visions of the future. People get to choose from different political parties. I think the post-ideological technocratic age actually sucked the life out of politics and wasn't very positive. Of course, when we say polarisation now, we know that there's something rather more toxic about it, because I think that maybe what I wasn't expecting, and I genuinely was not expecting this, I wasn't expecting that because I was saying that I'd vote Leave, and then subsequently then did vote Leave and then defended voting Leave, that I'd be accused of being a xenophobe, a racist, and so on and so forth. So there was an attempt at delegitimising the majority of voters in that referendum, that we were influenced by Russian bots, didn't know what we were voting for, or worse, you know, kind of enablers of fascism and the worst kind of backward, vile ideologies. So the polarisation became one of demonisation. And I think, by the way, that then happened the other way around. So then, of course, people started to get defensive and said, I'm not the racist, and then started calling people Romaniacs and Ramonas and all that. So it's become, I'd say that political polarisation is good, but when it becomes that personalised, vicious, nasty type of polarisation, obviously we can all feel it. That is not a positive thing in politics.
Yeah, so obviously Claire's brought up this notion of demonisation. Is there another side to that story when we go to look at the referendum question, as we briefly mentioned before? When people went into the ballot boxes, did they know exactly what they were voting for, be it Remain or Leave, John?
I think it's absolutely clear that people, whether they were voting Remain or whether they were voting Leave, had no idea what they were voting for, because ultimately, when we voted to leave the European Union, we didn't actually vote on what type of relationship we were going to have with the European Union after we'd left. And even if we'd voted to Remain, I don't doubt for 1 second that wouldn't have been the end of the debate, because people like Nigel Farage and others were, it's made it his life's ambition to make sure that we leave the European Union, and the issue wouldn't have gone away. But to say that somehow people knew what they were voting for, I mean, I remember listening to politicians arguing, of course, leaving the European Union doesn't mean leaving the single market and the customs union, and other people were saying, oh, leaving it means we just leave completely, and different people voted for different reasons. Claire's absolutely right. There were plenty of people that voted Leave for perfectly reasonable, sensible reasons as far as they were concerned. I remember speaking to one or two people on the doorstep who were saying, well, I voted to be part of the European community and to have an economic relationship with Europe, but I didn't vote for what we've got now. And you can't really argue with that. Over the decades, the relationship that we had within the European Union has changed fundamentally. So those people who said, well, I felt cheated because I voted for it in the 70s, and what we got in the 70s isn't what we've got now.
Okay.
So there were plenty of people that voted for perfectly legitimate reasons, but nobody had a clue what they were actually voting for, because nobody knew what our relationship with Europe was going to be afterwards.
Let's bring Graham in here, because obviously the Conservative Party is the one at the moment that has a deal tabled that proposes to appease everybody, as it were, that will be a solution to go forward. Do you think that in the referendum people went to vote and they had a clear idea in their head of what that vote really meant?
Well, of course there will have been a spectrum of different views that people held. What is certainly the case, and I wasn't particularly involved in the official Leave campaign, but what was certainly the case is the Leave campaign set a pretty clear course, which was towards a relationship with the EU that was going to be based on a free trade agreement and cooperation on other aspects such as environment and security and so on. And that is, if the Conservative Party comes back in this election with a majority, that is essentially the deal which is on the table and which will be implemented, and we will end up, albeit about 5 years too late, we will end up with exactly the kind of proposition that the Leave campaign was putting forward at that time.
But there's absolutely no guarantee of that, though, is there? because once the withdrawal agreement if it's ever agreed by Parliament, that is just the beginning of the process, not the end. And when politicians talk about getting Brexit done, it's a complete nonsense. It's actually getting Brexit started.
Well, it's getting to the point where we have actually left the EU legally, gone into a transition arrangement that allows all those sharp edges to be smoothed out and gives a period of time in which to negotiate.
No deal.
In which, but it's not going to result in
but
no
it
deal.
could.
But I think it's such an important point. It won't result in no deal because, I mean, whilst there are all sorts of arguments about what kind of agreements can be achieved in terms of trade in services, trade in goods is massively skewed in favour of the other EU countries. It's more in their interest to have a free trade agreement for goods than it is in ours. It is going to be very straightforward to negotiate that. Okay. The challenge for us is trying to make sure we have as open a system for trade and services alongside that as well.
And I'm sure we'll talk later on in the third segment about the practical implications going forward. We have this idea in the referendum that on one side we have people saying that they knew definitely what they were voting for, this is a clear mandate for Brexit, and on the other we have a sort of idea that actually it was as clear as mud and there needs to be more sort of elucidation to enlighten us going forward. This idea of informing the public then must be central. In fact, the Socratic criticism of democracy is that it's very difficult to inform people well enough to allow them to vote. I'll bring Claire in here, do we see some maybe of the underhand tactics and campaigning as sort of compromising that information process in some way?
Well, this is where I think your broader question of the programme is very important, because we have heard over the last 3.5 years since the failure to implement the Brexit vote in many ways, we've heard some arguments that I consider to be anti-democratic and quite regressive that often feature the need to inform and educate the electorate. I mean, some of these democratic fights, well over a century old and were fought for, was, you can imagine when there was an attempt in bringing in universal suffrage, that a lot of the arguments against universal suffrage was the problems of, uneducated people not being able to read and write, not being able to understand the nature of democratic process, women in particular. I mean, why would you let them vote? I mean, they couldn't possibly grasp anything. But, we've just had the Poppy Day and commemoration around the First World War. Many of those soldiers that didn't vote, wouldn't have the vote. I mean, can you imagine? That's kind of unbelievable to me, fighting for your country, not getting the vote. And the arguments that were put forward was that people wouldn't understand the complexities of running a country. And one of the things that was swept away in the modern era was the notion that, that there was some sort of educational test you had to pass in order, because you can say, well, it's very, very complicated to decide in a referendum how we will untangle ourselves from all the institutions of the European Union. Well, it's quite complicated in a general election to decide how you're going to run transport, health service and all the rest of it. That's representative democracy. I understand it's different than a plebiscite. But nonetheless, that argument's always been a feature of trying to curtail popular sovereignty. And I hoped we'd moved away from that to trust people. People will have had different levels of understanding of what they were voting for in the referendum. But what we don't usually do is ask them. There's not usually a test. Yeah. Did you understand? Why did you vote? Yes. Retrospectively, constantly people say to me, but what were you voting for? Well, I don't need to answer that as it happens. And I think that people were much more informed than people make out, because I actually found that people were educating themselves. I was surprised, but nonetheless, I was like going and doing talks. People would be saying things like, we were having a family conference, so-and-so's Googling, I'm doing this. Everyone was everyone was engaged. Went to the pub, went to the hairdresser. I remember the hairdresser, what are you doing? Big arguments, my mum's care home, all of this was going on. So I think that there's a prejudice that by and large I think has got a certain snobbery about it, because it's also true that when I talk to a lot of student groups, and in one instance were a group of international relations students who didn't appear to have any understanding of the difference between the EU Commission, the Council and the Parliament, and kept telling me they wouldn't be able to travel. So, you know, I'm mocking them, which is not fair. I'm simply pointing out, generally the debate subsequently has not been, the problem with that referendum was that international relations students weren't educated enough. What they mean is the people of Salford didn't know what they were doing. That's what they really mean, if we're honest. And I think that that's a dangerous... So I don't think that people need to be educated by those that know before they vote, because that is what you call manipulation, patronising and anti-democratic.
Just quickly before we move on to the next segment, John, if we just ask your opinion on this matter, do you think there, and what Claire's bringing up is essentially debate and discussion and informing yourselves, do you think that curiously this whole affair has actually sort of spurred the enthusiasm of the electorate? Do you think that it's hiked?
I think if there's one positive to come out of the whole Brexit issue, is that people have taken they've taken more notice of politics and the impact that politics has on their life. Not necessarily in a positive way. I think we probably all come across people on a regular basis who are just sick to the death of it. But people tend to be far more engaged now in the whole political process as a result of the chaos that's ensued for the last 3 years.
Okay, fantastic. Now, let's move on from the referendum to the aftermath. After Mrs May's repeated attempts to put a deal through Parliament, marches of people demanding a people's vote, and Boris Johnson resorting to another general election, the Brexit question remains unresolved. And it was George Bernard Shaw, we've got a literary quote here, who said that democracy is the advice that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve. We'll start with Graham. Are we getting what we deserve at the moment?
No. I would say that one of the very odd things about the 2017 election is that even though cards on the table, the Conservative Party fought the worst general election campaign, not just in British history, but since the Greeks invented democracy, is that in spite of that, we increased our vote by 2.5 million between 2015 and 2017, and by a vote share from 37% up to nearly 43%. That 43% of the vote gave Margaret Thatcher 2 landslide majorities and Tony Blair 2 landslide majorities. And John will come back with some interesting points about electoral reform based on that. But the crucial thing is it was because the opposition vote really accreted behind one party that it didn't deliver the majority that the people essentially had voted for.
Yep.
So it was a quirk of British politics at that point. I would say because people didn't really know Jeremy Corbyn very well and didn't know how worried they should be about a hard left kind of politics that was being served up to them. I think they're a bit more familiar with it now.
I think I should pick you up on that, because 43% of the vote doesn't produce a majority for anybody, or shouldn't produce a majority for anybody.
Well, I gave you the cue for that, but the fact is it very often does produce big majorities in our electoral
that is
system.
one of our massive failings in our electoral system.
Well, you and I will, of course, disagree.
Let's not diverge onto first past the post. We might just get stuck there for hours. But
the fact is, the people did vote and shifted their percentage support between parties in a way that was responding to a perfectly sensible cue at that point, which was essentially the same proposition as we got in this general election, which was, let's vote for a party that's going to see this through. And they wanted it seen through in a sensible way. They wanted it done preferably with a withdrawal agreement, all of those things. But that is what they voted for. Okay. They just ended up with no overall majority in Parliament and the messiest House of Commons that really couldn't reach any proper decisions, and where even many of the members of Parliament who were elected on manifesto promises that they would implement the referendum result, then spent the ensuing 3 years trying to prevent the 2.5 years, whatever it was, trying to prevent the referendum result being implemented.
Okay, so we'll bring John in on this. So we've got Graham saying that people want this done. The Lib Dems policy at the moment is to get, if they can get a majority, to revoke Article 50. Simply jumping at the deep end, do the Lib Dems know better than the voters? And is Graham wrong in saying that that's what the people want?
No,
is it to be done?
I wouldn't say that at all. If the voting public decided to put Joe Swinton into number 10 and give the Liberal Democrats a majority government, we would have a mandate. We would have a mandate to stop Brexit. What is certainly the case is when political parties are talking about getting Brexit done, That's completely wrong, and it's trying to deceive the electorate, because delivering the withdrawal agreement is just the start of the process. I can't repeat this often enough, because everyone's got to understand that if we go down the route of agreeing the withdrawal agreement, it's going to be years before Brexit is done. The only way to get Brexit done is to stop Brexit. Yes, in the future, if another party decided that they wanted to reopen chaos, they'd be perfectly entitled to stand in a future general election on a platform of going down the route of Brexit again. If people were, in my opinion, daft enough to vote for the chaos that we've had for the last 3 years again, that would be democracy.
Well, we have Claire over here who probably has a different solution to getting Brexit done. You talk about the withdrawal agreement taking years. Your party want a clean break Brexit. Surely that would be a way of getting it done, would it not?
Yes, but I actually think, for the purposes of the themes of this programme, it's more important to really get to the nub of what happened in relation to Parliament and the electorate, because I think this is a hugely historically important moment. I think that Graham, you explained it very well at the beginning. I mean, but people, you know, I think that people thought in that 2017 election, one way or another, that they were voting. All sorts of people thought all sorts of things, but there was a commitment by both Labour and the Conservatives to honour the manifesto of delivering on Brexit. And to be frank with you, you ended up, however, with a parliamentary situation where Parliament decided to renege on their own manifesto, and this is across the board. This is across the board, right?
Not in the Liberal Democrats.
I know, across the board of the two main parties that got elected, but then it gets exacerbated. So far too many Conservatives suddenly decided they didn't want to do that. The Labour Party, in particular, were suddenly at odds with the huge swathes of their own electorate, who were Labour leavers, or, you know, approximately 5 million, but not just that. But the main thing you got a Parliament that just defiantly refused to implement the referendum. And I'm afraid that Theresa May and her deal, which was kind of, the worst thing about it was this sort of notion of taking back control, suddenly disappeared behind closed doors for years, suddenly emerges out in the Chequers agreement. People looked at it and said, oh my God, whatever that is, it's not Brexit, right? The Theresa May deal comes forward, everyone can see real flaws with it on all sides. And in the meantime, that whole sort of energy, that political desire, the excitement of actually having won a referendum, but also then a chance to reboot the UK economy, UK politics, democratic reform, all is dissipating away, and a real bitter sense of disillusion setting in. So what I think that you can't underestimate, and the reason why I stood in, you know, why the Brexit Party, which didn't exist after all 6 months ago, whatever, you know, the reason why it emerged, and the reason why people like me who'd never dreamt of standing in for a party stood, was because you could see that the electorate in this country were beginning to think that democracy was not for them. And it was a visceral, bitter blow to discover the establishment were prepared to kick them in the teeth and tear their vote up. And I thought the consequences of not giving something hopeful in the European elections, which we'd inadvertently stumbled into because we weren't meant to be having them at all, but the 29th of March was yet another date that kind of, you know, came and went. Meant that I thought that the best way to do that was to give some kind of democratic expression to it. So the clean break Brexit question only works in relation to this. When we left the European Union and voted to leave, I did not say, no, we don't want a deal, walk away. I assumed that there would be a hard negotiation, hard fought, based on good faith, where you'd say, we are leaving the European Union, these are our demands, etc. Anyone who's negotiating, I'm a trade union negotiator of the past, I know how you negotiate, try at least. And then you discovered that actually what had happened, crudely put, was that people had said, oh my God, something terrible has happened in the UK. The electorate have voted to leave the European Union. Can we come up with a deal that doesn't disrupt anything at all, that won't upset the big corporates, that, you know, I mean, this was terrible. So it didn't keep anybody happy. So I've got to the point where I think the cleanest way to go would be clean break Brexit. I appreciate that the deal that's on offer now, I don't think it's much better than Theresa May's, but I think it's marginally better. You negotiate your way around that. But the crisis is democratic in nature, not deal. It's not about the deal. It's about how you honour that vote.
Let's just pick. Oh, sorry.
But Claire, do you seriously think that people in 2016 voted for what you're describing as a clean Brexit? I would describe as a chaos Brexit, but you describe as a clean Brexit, a clean break from the European Union. Do you really think that the referendum question and the campaigning around the referendum seriously contemplated that as an option?
Actually, I do, but I'm not arguing that everybody thought that. I agree with that point, because the reason I know that some of it was because actually the people who were arguing that we should remain in the European Union, led by George Osborne, Cameron and everybody else, told us what the consequence of voting leave would be, and they actually described what I would now call a clean break Brexit. They were doing it to frighten us, because they said, we'll tear up every international treaty, we won't have any, and people said, oh yeah, thank you, voted to leave. But where you're right, but look, can we go beyond seeing this as a technocratic question? Because you know, like when the demonstrators in Hong Kong started demonstrating, right? Initially it was on something quite particular, a very narrow point about a new law that was being brought in. After having had months of being treated in a particular way by the Hong Kong state, things move on. And I do think in that 3.5 years, quite a lot has moved on. Now, your party would say that's why you need a second referendum. I think what's happened is that people's demand for Brexit to happen is harder and more consolidated now than ever before. And I think that my view was, if the deal didn't allow us to leave properly, I'd rather have a clean break and take the risk, because I believe in democracy, than your version, which is to ignore the democratic wishes of the people. Before they've been implemented, have a referendum that would overturn the one that hadn't just happened.
Coming here on this, you say that the people's will for Brexit is increasing, and you sort of allude to this idea of the establishment versus the people. I looked up some figures on the Gov website, and if just to see if the label of Parliament versus the people is fair, we can discuss that. In terms of constituencies, 406 voted to leave and 242 voted to remain. However, of the MPs elected in 2015, 486 were for remain and a meagre 160 will leave. Graham Brady, obviously you've been a part of that Parliament and seen it become paralysed, as Boris Johnson so eloquently said. Is Parliament versus the people a fair summary of those figures, do you think?
Well, it shouldn't be, but I mean the crucial point is that the number of us who were elected in 2017 on that platform, that was very clear that we would respect the referendum results. So you had a clear, very strong majority of the House of Commons that voted for a referendum that said we will implement the result, whatever it may be. An equally strong majority that then voted to implement Article 50 and start the withdrawal process. Then you had an election in which 85% of the electorate voted for parties that were pledged to leave and to respect that referendum outcome. But then you had this very strange thing happening over the 2 years, that gradually, whilst Parliament would always, or the majority of parliamentarians, and I accept John's party was always pledged not to implement the outcome of the referendum, even though they have been the first people to call for an in-out referendum on Europe, I think in 2010. Yeah. But throughout that throughout that short Parliament, it was an in or out referendum you wanted.
I remember.
But throughout that Parliament, what you had was members of Parliament still saying, oh yes, I'm still committed to implementing the outcome of the referendum, but whenever a vote occurred that would give effect to that, they would vote against it. And you had this increasing complexity of people putting up new measures that were new obstacles to make sure that whilst they said they still willed the ends, they would never allow the means to be put in place. And I think that was where trust from the electorate was really eroded, and people started to get very frustrated with what appeared to be a pretty dishonest approach being taken by a very large number of people in Parliament.
I think Graham, your constituency is a really interesting example, because in 2016, in the referendum, it voted to remain. You were a leaver. You were re-elected in 2017 on a platform to deliver Brexit. So you could say you've got a mandate from the electorate to do that. But in the European elections, the Liberal Democrats won your constituency. and we have a platform now of remaining, having a second referendum, or going into government and revoking Article 50. So your constituents have, from time to time, either said we want to remain in the European Union. We've backed Graham Brady as our MP, who's a leaver. We've then backed to the Liberal Democrats, who actually want to have a second referendum. So I don't think it's very clear that somehow people made a decision in 2016 and they haven't changed their mind since.
Well,
because I think
yeah.
there's a lot of evidence that people in different areas of the country have changed their mind. Yes, ardent leavers have become even more ardent leavers. Ardent remainers have become even more ardent remainers. But those people who, on balance, weren't really that bothered whether we stayed or left in 2016, probably on balance either stayed at home or went out and voted leave. I think 3 years down the line, those same people who were not quite sure whether they wanted to leave or remain, I think those people would be key to deciding whether or not in a second referendum.
Just as a follow-up to that, John, you say that the Remainers are getting more ardent and the Leavers are becoming more ardent. What sort of evidence are we basing this on? What sort of polls are we saying that Remainers, that more people would come out in force?
No, I'm talking about anecdotal evidence as far as I'm concerned, but all the polls in relation to membership of the EU have consistently been about the same ever since. I think the last polls have suggested that it's pretty much 50-50. And then if you do a poll on do you want a no deal Brexit or some sort of other deal Brexit or remaining in the European Union, again it's about a third and a third. Depending on which question you ask, you get a different answer. But to say that somehow people simply, there was a referendum in 2016. We have to deliver that, whether it takes 3 years, 5 years, 100 years, because people in 2016 demanded that we left the European Union, is a nonsense. If that was democracy, so therefore we have to implement it, why on earth do we have election after election? Because, the Conservatives Conservatives got a majority in 2015. Just leave them in power forever.
I just want to respond to this.
Absolutely.
First of all, I think it is a key point, I think, about honesty in politics and honesty with your electorate, because I set out in some detail in 2015 how I'd approach this issue, and I got the highest vote that I'd ever had at that point. I then campaigned to leave in the 2016 referendum and have been active in arguing the case, and in 2017 I got a higher vote than I got the time before. So I do think that people, even if they don't necessarily always come to the same conclusion as you do, will respect it if you set out honestly where your position is. But I also think the polls suggest that most people think they probably voted the right way last time. My anecdotal contribution would be based on a huge number of conversations on doorsteps and supermarkets and in pubs or whatever in my constituency with the very large part of the electorate that actually wasn't extreme one way or the other, for whom it was a very finely balanced decision. And I've had so many conversations with people who said, look, I never much liked the EU. I thought it was doing all sorts of things wrong. It was expensive, it was undemocratic, but I was a bit nervous about what would happen if we voted to leave. But now we've voted to leave, I think we should do it. We should see it through. And I'm pretty clear that is the biggest shift in opinion. They'll still say they would vote the same way in 2016 had it been, had they had the opportunity again. But with what they've experienced since, they recognise, both because of the way the EU treated the UK in the negotiations, because of the way that Parliament has made a mess of the process, I think they are very clear we now need to move on and get this sorted.
And I suppose a key element of that, from that anecdotal evidence of people who voted Remain but say that they think it should be put through, would be the democratic question, would it not? A democratic vote was held and we should honour it, even if it's the sort of...
That is huge.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think the Liberal Democrats have put themselves in the wrong place, simply saying we'll ignore the outcome and revoke. But I think the other thing which is really important, and I've had this conversation over and over again, is the desire to have a smooth, orderly Brexit with the withdrawal agreement. And that's the crucial thing at this point, that we have got the deal on the table, and that if the Conservatives get a majority, we can deliver it.
Excellent.
So
unfortunately, it's time to move on to the next segment, but I'm sure we can get those comments into the next one. So the next segment is going to be about EU democracy itself. A discussion about Brexit and democracy wouldn't be complete without considering how democratic the European Union is itself. In leaving, do we move closer to democracy or further away? I'll start with you here, Claire, seeing as you were chomping at the bit at the end of the last one. There's an oft-cited view that the European Union's existence is a great way of ensuring that democracy survives on the continent after it fell in one way or another, or rather its democratic institutions fell at the end of the Second World War. How would you respond to that opinion?
Oh, I think it's the opposite of that. I think that the setting up of the European Union and the reason why I'm so opposed to it is because it's become a device through which each member state of that European Union has aspects of democratic decision making fenced off from the populations of those countries. I don't take a typically British Eurosceptic view that it's kind of a European foreign power imposing things on us. I mean, a lot of the laws that were introduced via the EU were suggested by British politicians. I mean, we saw that actually the whole of the British establishment practically lined up, and including the political elites, lined up behind staying in the European Union so Euroscepticism was a kind of cheap way of blaming somebody else for decisions that were being made. I've always thought that, right? It was an alibi, people would say, well, it's not our fault, Gov, the EU told us to do it. And you'd hear that from Labour and Tory. And often you'd find out that those very same politicians had suggested a lot of the legal changes. I understand that. But that's what every single one of the leaders of the different countries have done. In other words, it's an anti-democratic institution. It was set up to, and it basically, in its constitution, it basically says national sovereignty is a problem. National decision-making is a problem. And it's got, at its heart, the thing I was objecting to at the beginning of this programme, that notion that the technocrats, the experts, and I don't mean real, genuine expertise, I mean a group of people who consider themselves to be more in tune with what should happen in a particular country, they get to decide as opposed to trusting the electorates. And one of the things you say about, they didn't want to ever see war again, what they said was, we don't want to have too much democracy in Europe because look what happened. They actually, as it were, blame the rise of fascism in Germany or the threats of communism or, so Stalinism and so on around, on the basis that people had too much of a say. So a lot of the founding documents and of theories behind the EU is about creating a body that will decide what is best in the best interests of the different electorates around the country. So that to me is a pretty anti-democratic structure, and I am opposed to it because I believe that you should be able to hold people to account, and you can't directly do it. I'm in the European Parliament. People say, how can you say it's anti-democratic? You're elected to go there. Actually, since I've been in Brussels and Strasbourg, if ever I've had any doubts about my position on Europe, I mean, they've been utter. I mean, let me tell you, I viscerally hate the place. I mean, I like lots of the people, the other MEPs. I feel European. I've always felt European. It's the EU. I mean, this is a bureaucratic, anti-democratic situation, and the Parliament is the least important aspect of the troika of powers there, and it's playing politics. Nobody has a decent political discussion. Everything is carved up. Everything is given out in terms of groups of amounts of money. I mean, there's just no intellectual life there. It's dead intellectually and politically and democratically. And it's, you're there and you think, what would I even say to the people of the Northwest that I've been doing here? I try and speak as much as possible so there's films of me speaking so that people can have a look at them, because I feel so bad about going there and getting paid to do so little. I feel like at least I can make a democratic case for something. But you could walk around and feel very important in that place and then realise you've got no power at all, and that is the reality.
We talked there about this idea of people who know better, who are nominated, and one of the criticisms is of the Commission that initiates legislation that is nominated by the member states. Is it as simple as if you can't vote them out, it's not democratic? Or does it go a lot deeper than that?
Well, those same people are put in that position by the governments of the day in the individual states that have been elected by the people in those individual countries. So they are indirectly elected. But I don't think, and I think one of the problems that people who support us being in the EU have had over many years is the EU is far from perfect. And anyone who tries to suggest that the EU is perfect is frankly ridiculous. But there isn't. You find me a proper, perfect political system anywhere in the world. There isn't one. But to say it's undemocratic, yes, elements of it aren't democratic. They're not democratically elected. But the European Parliament is far more democratically elected than our Parliament,
because
for instance.
Because we have.
But it can't initiate legislation, so there's no
debate.
But that's about reforming the EU. We need to reform the EU so it's properly democratic.
So on that note, can I just ask how you would reform it then? Because it seems as though the Commission, its institutions are fairly concrete.
Rigid.
How would you go about reforming that quite endemic?
Our Parliament is just equally as rigid. And no one throws the same criticism at our Parliament.
The House of Lords, I think, it gets a fair bit of scrutiny.
And
I'm not saying that makes them equal. I'm just saying that there is a debate in this country about.
There's been a debate over decades about the role that the House of Lords plays. I mean, in some way, in the time that I had in Parliament, I actually think the House, although I would abolish it and have a second chamber that was wholly elected, I actually think the second chamber does a very good job of scrutinising legislation, because they probably have far more time than MPs have to spend scrutinising legislation in great detail. But I would still reform it, because I'm a Democrat. I believe that the two chambers in Parliament should be democratically elected, and I would like to see more democracy in the EU and more power for the European Parliament. But to say that somehow the EU is less democratic than our system, where we don't even have a fair system of putting people into power. Graham referred to before about landslide majorities on 40% of the votes. Tony Blair in 2005 got a 60 majority on 36% of the votes. That's not democracy.
Yeah, okay, let's bring Graham in there, because obviously we did have a referendum on electoral reform, and as Claire mentioned earlier, it was quite a low turnout that came, and we kept first past the post. Do you think that our current system, including the two chambers and the voting system, is democratic? We've had the claim that no democracy is perfect and that they all need reform. How close to ours is ours to perfection?
I mean, I had the shocking realisation when John was speaking that there is something that we agree on, because I've always voted for a wholly elected Senate to replace the House of Lords as well, and I also agree that the existing House of Lords does a superb job of revising legislation, but I think it's just impossible to justify it as a part of a democratic or a legislature that ought to be democratic. But the thing that I very much disagreed about was John's assertion that the means of election to the European Parliament is better than ours. Now, you can debate whether proportional systems are fairer or not, but the thing which is, in my view, absolutely abhorrent in the system that we use to elect MEPs is these big regional constituencies and party lists to populate the places that are elected. So you are doubly distancing the people who are elected from the electorate. First of all, Claire being, of course, an exception because of the size of her personality and her intellect, but the possibility we've known each other for a long time. But the first thing is that because of the size of these constituencies, there is no earthly possibility that people know who their member of the
so they don't feel represented.
They don't feel represented. They can nab me in the street in Altrincham or in Sale, and they can call me over and they can say, I don't agree with this. Absolutely. And when it comes to it, if they don't like what I've done, they've got an opportunity to vote me out of office. It doesn't work that way if you've got a northwest regional constituency with what I forget what it is now, 7 or 8? 8 MEPs, and they're carved up according to the number of votes that each party got, but then the parties decide who goes in. It's completely undemocratic on two fronts, the size of the constituency and these awful party list systems.
That works as a nice segue into the European elections. Obviously, this is your foray into standing on the front line of politics. And you said, I watched your acceptance speech, and you said that this now gives the Brexit Party a clear mandate to take Britain out on a clean break Brexit. I'm just wondering, with this discussion of British system versus the European system, how would that mandate compare to, say, the mandate which we discussed earlier from a general election?
No, I mean, there was a European election. The Brexit Party stood on a very clear mandate, and it won the European elections. But first of all, it is important to note, because I think this does matter. The Brexit Party won. I didn't win, and I was very conscious of that. I mean, I was number one on the list, as I am not to everyone's taste by any stretch of the imagination, right? And I actually found that difficult because we had a slate of candidates, and I would have preferred even that of the Brexit Party candidates that you didn't have to have me number one. You know what I mean? Because I didn't feel it was fair. Because if you're voting Brexit Party, you're kind of endorsing me. And that didn't seem right. I mean, no, but, if you didn't want to, right? A lot of people wouldn't want to. So just to say on the technicalities of it, no, I mean, the Brexit Party has tried to campaign and argue for what it said then. I mean, one of the things that we haven't discussed, but I think feeds into what we were talking about earlier, is that I was really taken by how much of the Change Politics for Good slogan, which was Brexit Party, a kind of slogan of the European elections, that really resonated. And I was trying to explain how Brexit has become more than Brexit for people. Now, I don't know what's going to happen in this general elections, and it's not as though, it's uncontroversial in terms of whether Brexit Party is going to do, whether it's going to be squeezed or exist, or what happens. We could maybe talk about that. But what I would say was, everywhere I've gone, people have said things like, we now want to change things. We don't just want a two-party system. We want to get rid of the House of Lords, an elected second chamber, because the House of Lords, after all, has not played an honourable role in relation to the Brexit discussion, whatever about scrutinising other things. At one point, just felt like it just kept voting to scupper Brexit. I mean, that was what it was doing. I mean, it was ridiculous. And some of the speeches by, unelected Lords were profoundly anti-democratic. So people want to change first past the post. I myself have gone from being not sure about PR to thinking maybe we should look at it to make representative democracy work better, because I think that too often people don't feel represented, and I don't know what to do about that. In other words, I think a big shake-up is required. And in that sense, I've tried to, and will try to, not because I'm the Brexit Party, because I think with a new movement that just starts, what you're trying to do is to encapsulate and capture what you consider to be the big democratic issues of the day. And that was captured for me by a new party. But I think that this genie's not going back in the bottle. That's really what I'm trying to say. I object, by the way, to the Tory slogan of "Get Brexit Done." I mean, I just think, so dull. I mean, it's like, get it done, get it over the line. Because, no, but it's also a bit like, and then we can all go back to normal. And I think, go back to normal, this bit we agree on. It's not going back, but it's not just not going back to normal because there's going to be a long transition that'll drag on, but actually because nobody wants it to go back to normal. People voted to shake up the status quo and to change things. And I think you've got to feel that leaving the European Union means something, because that's what people decided to do. They wanted to leave one set of institutions so they have more democratic control over what happened at home. It would give people more of a chance to shape the future of the society they live in, not kind of leave the EU and be led by a bunch of technocrats who say, let's go back to normal at home. We might be able to vote them out, but that still misses the democratic spirit of that original vote.
So instead of the Brexit vote actually being a one-issue vote, it's actually, in your view, transformed itself into a wide-scale political shake-up.
It's been transformed into that.
Okay.
But anyway, leaving the European Union and its institutions was never just, it was, that's why it was a sovereignty question. That's why Dominic Cummings' famous, take back control resonated. It was absolutely clearly about leaving a set of anti-democratic institutions you couldn't control the decisions of, because you cannot change what happens in the EU if you're a voter in Salford. That just doesn't happen, because the decision-making process, you can change who you send to the European Parliament, who then can't decide anything. So what good is that? So you're never, ever able to hold anyone to account for decisions taken, big legislative outcomes that actually will affect the way we are governed and the decisions we make in this country. You as a voter have no control over, and that's what people didn't want.
John, the Lib Dems got 16 seats in the 2019 EU elections. We've got a couple of questions. So first we'll start off with discussing what that means for your party and also this question of remaining ultimately.
Well, we were the second biggest party in the European elections. I must say I was delighted to see the combined Labour and Tory vote at about 25%. I hope it's not the only time in my lifetime. But it was a big endorsement of the Liberal Democrats being the main party of Remain. What we need to see is translation of that endorsement of as also as the party of Remain into this general election. My concern is that, as in 2017, both Labour and the Tories don't actually want to talk about Brexit in this election. They want the reason why we've had 2 years of chaos is because the 2017 election was turned into an election not about Brexit. And if people actually want the issues surrounding Brexit resolved, they actually have to vote in this general election on the issue of Brexit and where they stand on Brexit. And if they want to leave the European Union, well, you've got a choice of voting Conservative or voting Brexit Party, and in some parts of the country voting Labour as well. If they want to stay in the European Union, if they want to remain in the European Union, there's only one way of doing that, and that's voting Liberal Democrat.
Seeing as we're coming to the end, I'm going to do something which politicians are often reluctant to do, and that's answer the question. Are we facing a democratic crisis? We'll start with you, Graham.
I think we've been facing a parliamentary crisis. I think this House of Commons has not served the people well, and there was a very clear task for it to perform when it was elected in 2017. That was to oversee the government in the process of delivering that referendum outcome, what Parliament and the government had promised the people it would do. And it failed. And even on that dreadful, messy Saturday sitting that seemed so exciting but was so completely pointless, when we all trooped back down to Westminster on a Saturday morning, missing the rugby, to participate in that process. Of course, they voted for the second reading and then voted against the procedural motion that would have allowed the bill to go on, which again was just a grubby kind of deception and really let the people down badly.
So is it fair to say that the democratic problem isn't endemic, it's not part of the system, it was that one parliament, and next election will solve it?
I'm not going to say there are no problems, and I think that there's a great deal that needs to be done. It's not just leaving the European Union. I think we all need to make ourselves more accountable. And one of the reasons that I supported leaving, and very much on grounds of sovereignty and democracy, is that I think members of Parliament here and the governments that they sustain in office ought to be genuinely accountable to the people. And Claire's point earlier, this institution sitting between the decisions that are taken and the people, so that we could all say, oh, of course I agree with you, Mrs. Smith, but we can't do anything about it, it's these dreadful Europeans, is an enormous excuse for national politicians. Once that's out of the way, it allows us to start the process of making our own politics better, but it's not the end of it. Just aware of running out of time, so Claire Fox, democratic crisis, yes or no?
We are in a democratic crisis and have been for the last 3 years. One thing I'd say is that the EU knows that. And one thing we haven't talked about is that I've become conscious since I've been an MEP that the EU now think that we're going to leave. And they've become conscious of the fact that, despite what we were talking about earlier, that actually they got a shock in the European elections when they saw the votes, because they didn't think, oh look, the Lib Dems have come second. They thought, oh, the Brexit Party. There's still a lot of people who want to leave the EU, and I think my experience was they started off treating us like that we're going to stop them leaving. And even in the short time I've been there, they basically said they better go. And the reason I say that in relation to a democratic crisis is even they can see that democracy has to be honoured. And I've heard them say, actually, we can't stop people who want to leave the European Union leaving the European Union. Even though they've tried, they can't.
30 seconds left. John?
I wouldn't describe it as a democratic crisis. I'd describe it as a democratic deficit. The elephant...
It was actually a Lib Dem who termed that in the 80s in an EU leaflet, actually.
The elephant in the room that we've not discussed is the media's role in creating views and opinions, and the media are trying to manipulate this election, and we have a democratic deficit within our own parliament, and we should worry about that more than we should worry about our role in the EU.
Okay, wonderful. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for. I'd like to thank our guests, John Leech, Claire Fox and Sir Graham Brady, for joining us today. We'll be back on your screens on the 28th of November for our general election special, in which we'll be putting candidates for the Salford and Eccles constituency under the spotlight. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time.